All right, folks. Well, welcome to our first week talking about course syllabi. So, our goal for this week and next week is to help you draft a practice or mock or sample syllabus for a class. This is one of the documents that, when you are looking for creative writing teaching jobs, you sometimes will get asked to submit as part of an application, but it's also good practice for whether you have already taught or not, for thinking through the arc of a course, because you may not get asked to share a specific syllabus document when applying for a job, but you might find yourself needing to be able to talk through how you go about teaching. And one way to think through that, if you don't have opportunities to actually teach, is the building of a syllabus for a class that you would teach, because then you can speak, even if hypothetically, about what the arc of those courses might look like. So this is going to touch on some very broad scale things. And then there's another video in this module that will look at the building of the actual course itself in your course schedule. So let's talk about a few things. Let's begin. I just want to make a few comments on institutional templates. So lots of colleges and universities have requirements for how instructors put together their syllabi. So you may have noticed in this program, for example, that our syllabi all look very, very similar. And that's because Lindenwood has a very specific sort of plug-in document that we put our specific things for our classes in. These often give faculty guidance on what they need to include, and as is the case with Lindenwood's, where they need to include it. And so when you have a teaching job, you will need to follow those. You'll usually get, I like to call it, gently whacked if you don't. But when you are putting together your syllabus, so for the purposes of our class, especially right now, but also whenever you might need to submit such a thing to an institution, you needn't worry about that. You can just structure it and style it and format it however you would like. You're going to see with some of the sample syllabi in our course shell here that there's a wide variety of things. So you don't need to worry about that as it relates to our assignment, or when you are putting together a sample for a job application. Now, there are going to be some things that you're going to want to make sure that you include. And so we're going to talk about most of these in some detail here, but these are kind of the 6 biggest parts. And generally speaking, though certainly with exceptions, these are often the sequence in which these things appear. Again, you will probably notice in some of our samples that may not be universal. I'm just really quickly going to mention, when I talk about contact information, is going to be like your name, your university affiliated email address, your university affiliated phone number if you've been given one, when you are available to meet with students during office hours, that sort of stuff. For our purposes, you can just put your name. You don't need to pretend that you have that. You don't need to share your phone number with all of us. You don't need to pretend that you have office hours. And then the only thing I'm going to say about required texts is that is going to be if you have any textbooks that students are supposed to purchase for a class. You don't have to list, if you have given them a link to a single short story or to a poem or a specific essay, you wouldn't need to list all of those things, just if there's any book length required texts that they're going to be using. Okay. So I just wanted to mention that about those first. So then let's talk about some of the rest of this. So let's first start by talking about your course description and your objectives. For our purposes, you get to invent your course description and your course objectives. At many universities, courses have catalog descriptions that are preset and pre-exist. And so if you find yourself teaching one of those, you would need to use that. But for our purposes, your goal is you're going to write your own, and your goal is to just kind of give the person reading it a sense of what the course is. What are we going to study? How are we going to go about studying it? What kinds of things am I going to learn? Similarly, your course objectives are the things that students will be able to do by virtue of having taken the course. So at the end of our course, students will be able to do this thing. They'll be able to do this thing. They'll be able to do this thing. And so your objective in writing course objectives is to give these as close and specific action verbs of what students will be able to do by virtue of having taken your class. Okay. So then you're going to provide, in some order, in some fashion, a list of your course's major assignments. So generally in the syllabus, what this wants to be is just sort of a list of the types of assignments that students are going to do. So again, for example, you have probably encountered in our classes here that there's lots of reading and discussion. There are writing journals. There are workshop pieces to submit. There is workshop feedback to give, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just a listing in some spot of what those things are. And then usually below that list is a description of each of those assignment types. And this does not need to be full blown instructions. You don't need to include all of the guidelines for every single instruction, but just, a few sentences that explain what kind of work those assignments are. So you might see in a sample syllabus that, workshop pieces are 2 short stories of approximately 3 to 5,000 words each or something like that. Reading and discussions are students' opportunity to engage with the model text that we read, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So just these short little blurbs about each of those things. And then you also want to incorporate some information on grading. And so this is really 2 things. So one is oftentimes what instructors will do is in that list of assignment types, they'll indicate, how many points they're each worth, or if someone's using percentages, like reading and discussions are worth 20% of the grade and each of them is 10 points. Workshops are 50% of the grade, blah, blah, blah. And what I also like to include is in those descriptions how they're going to be graded. So, these are graded on completion. These are graded on how long they are. Workshops are graded on not just that you turn your work in on time, but that you're giving feedback to your peers, following my instructions, et cetera, et cetera. So really, essentially, is there a qualitative component or is there a quantitative / completion component to how those things are going to be evaluated? So then we also get into some course policies. So every good syllabus is going to include a number of course policies. And one thing I should mention here is some universities, for all of these policies, I'll just go ahead and list them and then talk about them briefly. Some universities have blanket policies for some of this. As a general rule, and again, you needn't worry about following some institution's policies in writing this sample syllabus, but when you are teaching, you should check, but most of the time, it is okay for an instructor to be more generous about a policy that the university has, but it is not usually allowed to be stricter. So let's just say, for example, that a university has an attendance policy that students who miss 5 or more classes automatically fail. That's a mean policy. It's a bit archaic, but whatever. You probably would be permitted to say, in my class, that number is 7. But you would not be permitted to say, actually, you can only miss 3. So typically, an individual instructor can be more generous than a university policy, but not stricter than. But for our purposes, what you want to do is think about, what would your late work policies be? Are you going to let people turn anything in a day or 2 late? Are you going to take percentage points off for things? Is missing a certain number of classes going to have some kind of negative effect on their grades? What are your policies about AI or various assistive tools? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to what these are. But what I will just encourage you to think about is what kind of environment and attitude of strictness versus latitude, are you creating with your policies, right? So just thinking about that, I generally accept late work pretty, I like to offer a lot of grace. Obviously, in an online class, attendance is kind of a weird thing. We can talk about that in the discussion of the syllabi samples if that is something that comes up. But I think about what I want people to perceive as important to me as an instructor. Some people, it is perfectly fine and understandable that they have strictness, because that goes with their personality, that goes with the way they want to run their courses, and sometimes that is necessary. When I used to teach first year composition, for example, I had to be pretty strict about when rough drafts were due, because you can't really write a meaningful rough draft and then move to a final draft of an academic essay if you don't ever write the rough draft, right? So accepting those rough drafts really, really late was kind of counterintuitive to the idea of the recursive nature of writing, of getting into a process habit of writing a draft, revising it, and then submitting the final draft, those sorts of things. In other classes, it may be perfectly fine to have a later work policy. Maybe you want to be more generous with certain kinds of assignments, but not others. It's really hard to figure out how to let students make up workshop feedback late, for example, at a certain point. So you can be as fine-toothed as you want with these policies or not, but you want to include them. And as it relates to issues of participation behavior, what I mean there is if you have part of a grade being participation oriented, which lots of folks in creative writing classes, especially in-person classes, do, because you want people to talk to each other. You just want to set some boundaries for, what is productive conversation. You don't want to tell people they always have to agree with one another, but setting out how people should behave with one another, what it means to disagree respectfully, what it means to offer constructive criticism in a way that is meaningful and not nasty, and those sorts of things. So those sort of fit in there. And then, of course, this is not an exhaustive list. If there are other policies and ways of doing things that you want to incorporate, if you have particular ways in which you want people to submit work as tech, and especially in in-person classes versus online, establishing, do people need to submit printouts? Do they get to submit into an LMS like Canvas, et cetera, et cetera? So these aren't the only policies you might have, but these are ones that generally just about every syllabus includes. Okay, so then the last big thing is having to do with creating a schedule. So again, depending on the kind of class that you have dreamed up, whether it's an in-person class versus online, is probably going to dictate whether you provide a daily or a weekly outline. So if you are imagining, at most colleges and universities, creative writing classes are one of three things. They're either Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or some other arrangement of 3 days a week, or Tuesday, Thursday, or some other arrangement of 2 days a week. The former being about 50 minutes, the latter being 75. At the graduate level, sometimes in in-person classes, they are 3 hours once a week. So maybe there's actually 4. Or they're online, either in 8-week or 16 or 10 or 12-week increments, whatever. Typically with an online class, like I said, you're going to be outlining what you do over the course of a week, whereas with an in-person class, you're going to be outlining what students are going to do each day. I'm going to talk more in the second video in this unit about putting together the daily and weekly sense of a specific kind of class. I've already talked a little bit in a previous video about how to distinguish what that might look like based on the class level. So you can refer back to that if you need to. But you're going to include a couple of things here. So you're definitely going to include deadlines for assignments. So if students need to read something by a certain class session, put that reading assignment next to that class period. If they're going to, let's say, write 6 short writing exercises over the course of the term, you're going to want to figure out what dates you're going to have them turn those in. If they're going to turn in a workshop piece by a certain date, put it in there. You also want to sometimes, depending on the size of the class, the level of the course, and again, the next video will go into this more, giving a kind of general indication of the subject matter of given days or weeks in lowest level courses. This is more important than in higher level courses. But sort of charting out for students, if they're in an intro class, okay, these 3 weeks we're talking about fiction, or these 2 weeks we're talking about point of view / voice. So just trying to give those indications. So one thing I would suggest, and this is where I'll kind of wrap this, when you're thinking about making a schedule for a class, I actually start with this typically, and I start at the end. So I look at an academic calendar, and you, again, can just imagine, you don't need to have dates. You could have, I'm imagining a 15-week class in a fall semester, and it's 15 weeks. So week 1, 2, 3, blah, blah, blah. And maybe the class meets on Tuesday and Thursday, or Monday and Friday, whatever, it's up to you. And I usually start at the end. So I figure out, okay, they're going to turn in some kind of portfolio at the end of the term or whatever. That's due on this date. So if I'm working backward, what am I doing each week moving back to the start? What kind of assignments do I want to do? What kind of readings do I want to do? And then I build the syllabus in reverse. So I actually typically start with this thing and then build back from there. Okay. You can do this in any real way that you want. So those are sort of the basic pieces of the syllabus. The next video is going to go into thinking about how you chart that actual course in this schedule and what kind of things you want to consider depending on the level of the class. And then, of course, After you watch that video, you're going to want to go take a look at those sample syllabi that I think will really perhaps help you start thinking about how you might build your own. All right, that's it.